What would you do if your neighbor called the cops on you for working your own land, only to find out you're the law yourself? Get off my land! That's what Robert Jameson had been told more than once, even though he owned every inch of it. At 42 years old, Robert had worked too hard and sacrificed too much to let anyone make him feel like a stranger on his own soil. He wasn't just a farmer. He was a man who carried the weight of his family's name, his community's pride, and his own dream to finally create something lasting. The land stretched across several acres just outside of Mesa, Arizona, on the edge where suburbia met the open desert. He had saved for years, taking extra shifts, cutting back on personal luxuries, and pouring everything into this property. To Robert, the rows of tilled soil and the sturdy red barn weren't just pieces of a farm, they were symbols of independence. But to some of his new neighbors, especially the woman who sat as president of the local homeowners association, it was an eyesore, a disruption, and in her words, out of place. Her name was Linda Cartwright, and people around the neighborhood knew she liked to run things like a small-town mayor. She wasn't elected by any city, but she ruled her HOA with the same iron grip. On his very first week, Robert noticed her watching him from her porch across the road. Not a casual glance, not the friendly curiosity of a neighbor. It was something sharper, like she was waiting for him to slip up. At first, Robert tried to give her the benefit of the doubt. Maybe she was just cautious about new neighbors. But when she walked over the first time, clipboard in hand, and asked him to explain why he had so much machinery on his property, he understood exactly what kind of neighbor she was going to be. "Ma'am, this is my land," he told her calmly, wiping sweat from his brow as he stood beside his tractor. "I bought it fair and square. The HOA doesn't apply here." Her eyes narrowed, lips pursed so tightly they nearly disappeared. "Every property in this community must maintain a standard. Barns, crops, equipment. This isn't farmland. This is a neighborhood." Robert looked around at the manicured lawns, the identical beige stucco homes lined up in neat rows across the street. His barn was set far back, surrounded by open fields, clearly outside the HOA's reach. Still, he kept his tone measured. "I'm not under your rules. I checked with the county before I bought the place. This is agricultural zoning." Linda didn't like that answer. He could tell by the way she scribbled furiously on her clipboard, as if writing him up like an officer issuing a ticket. In that moment, Robert realized something important. This wasn't about zoning, or noise, or even appearances. It was about power. Linda Cartwright thrived on being in control, and the sight of someone she couldn't control, someone she thought didn't belong, was enough to keep her pacing, fuming, and scheming. Days turned into weeks, and her presence never faded. She'd slow her car when she drove past his fields, glaring from behind the wheel. She made subtle comments at neighborhood meetings, implying that Robert was changing the look of the community. He ignored most of it, focusing on his work, planting, repairing, and trying to build his farm into something steady. But every time he looked up and saw her watching, Robert felt the pressure. Farming was already grueling, the kind of work that broke your back and tested your patience. Add the weight of constant scrutiny, and it was more than just physical labor. It was psychological. One night, after a long day in the field, he sat on his porch with a glass of iced tea, listening to the cicadas buzz in the desert heat. His phone lit up with a message from his younger sister. "How's the new place? You settling in okay?" He typed back slowly, choosing his words. "The land's good. Hard work. But the people..." He erased the rest and just sent, "I'll be fine," because Robert wasn't the kind of man to complain. He carried himself with a quiet dignity. Still, deep down, he knew this wasn't over. Linda Cartwright wasn't the type to let things slide, and if she had already gone this far just watching him, it was only a matter of time before she took the next step. But Robert didn't know that the next step would involve flashing lights, sheriff's deputies, and a moment that would change the neighborhood forever. Robert woke early the next morning, as he always did. Farming doesn't wait for anyone. The sun dictates your schedule, and when the first streaks of light spilled across the Arizona desert, Robert was already out by the barn checking his equipment. The air still carried the coolness of dawn, but sweat was already gathering along his hairline. He was rolling a cart stacked with feed bags when he heard the sharp crunch of heels on gravel. Turning his head, he saw her. Linda Cartwright, clipboard tucked under her arm, sunglasses perched on her nose even though the sun hadn't fully climbed. Her stride was brisk, her posture rigid, and she looked like she was marching to battle. "Mr. Jameson," she called out. Her voice clipped. "We need to talk." Robert stopped the cart and leaned against it, already bracing himself. "Good morning to you, too." Linda ignored the greeting. She pointed toward his barn as if it were a crime scene. "That structure violates HOA standards. It's too large, and it's not approved." Robert sighed, pulling off his work gloves. "I told you before, Miss Cartwright. This land isn't part of the HOA. The county approved my permits. I double-checked before I bought it." Her mouth tightened. "Every property here affects the value of surrounding homes. Do you realize what kind of impression this gives to potential buyers? Rusting equipment, tractors, livestock. This isn't what people want to see when they move into a suburban community." Robert studied her carefully, then glanced across the street. A few neighbors had stepped outside, pretending to check their mail or water their lawns, but their eyes were fixed on the confrontation. He kept his tone level. "I didn't move here to drive property values. I moved here to farm. My land, my work. I'm not breaking any law." Linda stepped closer, lowering her voice, though it was clear she wanted the audience listening in. "You're making this harder than it needs to be. If you'd just cooperate, we could resolve this peacefully. Otherwise, I'll have no choice but to escalate." Robert straightened, meeting her gaze. "Escalate to what? You don't have authority over me." Her jaw twitched, and for the first time, a crack in her confidence showed. She adjusted her sunglasses and cleared her throat. "This isn't personal. It's about community standards." Robert didn't laugh, though part of him wanted to. "It sure feels personal." There was a beat of silence. Then she spun on her heel, striding back toward her home. Her words floated behind her. "You'll regret being difficult." Robert exhaled slowly, slipping his gloves back on and pushing the cart toward the barn. He thought about letting it go, but something in the way she said regret lingered. It wasn't the kind of word you used casually. It carried intent. Later that day, Robert drove into town for supplies. At the hardware store, an older man named Carl, who'd lived in the neighborhood for decades, pulled him aside. "Heard Linda's been after you. Don't take it too hard. She's like that with everyone." Robert raised an eyebrow. "Everyone?" Carl chuckled without humor. "Well, let's just say she's selective with who she gets along with. And when she doesn't like someone, she makes sure the whole neighborhood hears about it." Robert didn't respond, but the words sat heavy in his chest. He already knew what Carl meant without him saying it outright. By the time he returned home, there were 2 HOA notices stuck to his mailbox. Unsigned papers accusing him of noise violations and improper land use. Robert shook his head. "She doesn't quit, does she?" he muttered under his breath. That evening, as the sun bled orange across the desert horizon, Robert worked in his fields, determined not to let the tension swallow him. But he couldn't ignore the steady trickle of neighbors drifting by, pausing longer than usual to stare, whisper, and then move on. Linda was stirring the pot, and the community was beginning to simmer. His phone buzzed again. This time it was a text from his friend and fellow deputy, Marcus Lowe. "Everything all right? Heard your HOA's giving you trouble?" Robert typed back. "Trouble's an understatement." He stared at the barn, at the land he had worked so hard for. He wasn't about to be run off, not after everything he had sacrificed to build this dream. But something told him Linda Cartwright wasn't done yet. But what Robert didn't know was that her next move would bring the situation to a boiling point, and this time she wouldn't be satisfied with just notices and warnings. The tension didn't fade with time. It thickened. Each day brought a new reminder that Linda Cartwright wasn't going to let Robert live in peace. What started as sharp words and written notices soon turned into something more aggressive, something designed to push him off balance. It began small. One morning, Robert walked to his mailbox and found another slip of paper stuffed inside. No signature, just bold letters scribbled in ink. "This isn't farmland, leave." He turned it over in his hands, shaking his head. Anonymous notes. Cowardly and childish, but still irritating. That same week, he noticed tire tracks across the edge of his property, fresh grooves that didn't belong to his truck or tractor. Someone had pulled onto his land during the night, close enough to tear up the soil near his rows. Robert crouched down, running his fingers through the dirt. Whoever it was hadn't come to help. They came to send a message. When he mentioned it to Carl, the older neighbor from down the road, Carl let out a slow whistle. "That woman doesn't know when to stop. She's probably trying to rile you up so you'll react. Don't give her the satisfaction." Robert nodded, though anger simmered beneath his calm exterior. He had learned long ago that people often mistook patience for weakness. He wasn't weak. He just chose his battles. Still, Linda didn't make it easy. At the next neighborhood meeting, Robert sat quietly at the back, sipping from a paper cup of water, when Linda raised her voice over the chatter. "We need to address the situation on the east side," she announced, tilting her chin toward Robert. "Several members have expressed concerns about property values dropping due to certain unapproved activities." Murmurs filled the room. A woman whispered to her husband. Another man frowned at Robert. Finally, someone spoke up. "What's going on over there?" Linda leaned in, savoring the attention. "Heavy equipment, farming noises at all hours, and quite frankly, the smell. It's just not what this community was designed for." Robert set his cup down and stood. "Let me clear something up. My land isn't under HOA jurisdiction. I did everything legally, with the county's approval. I'm not breaking any rules." The room quieted. A few people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. One neighbor, a middle-aged woman named Sharon, who lived across from Robert, raised her hand timidly. "But it does change the neighborhood's feel," she said. Robert met her eyes. "Respectfully, Sharon, my land isn't here to decorate the neighborhood. It's here to grow food, provide work, and stand as something I've built with my own hands. I respect your right to mow your lawn how you like. All I ask is the same respect in return." His voice wasn't loud, but the steadiness in it carried weight. For a moment, the room was still. Then Linda slammed her clipboard onto the table. "We'll see what the authorities have to say about it," she snapped. Robert didn't respond. He simply gathered his things and left, refusing to give her the reaction she wanted. That night, though, as he sat on his porch under the desert stars, he couldn't shake the feeling that things were headed toward a breaking point. He thought about his late father, who had taught him never to let pride cloud judgment. "Stand your ground, son," his father used to say. "But know when someone's trying to drag you into a fight you don't need." The next morning, he was back in the fields, loading equipment from his truck into the barn. The sun was hot, even in the early hours, and his shirt clung to his back. That's when he heard the sharp click of heels again. He turned to see Linda striding toward him, this time without her usual clipboard. "You're done," she said flatly, stopping a few feet from him. Robert wiped his hands on a rag. "Morning to you, too." "I'm not joking, Mr. Jameson. I've had enough. If you don't remove this equipment by the end of the week, I'll call the police myself." Robert's eyes narrowed slightly, but his voice stayed calm. "You can call whoever you want, but I'll tell you now, you won't like the outcome." Linda tilted her head, smirking like she had the upper hand. "We'll see about that." She turned sharply and marched back toward her house, her heels kicking up dust. Neighbors peeked from behind blinds and across driveways, the silent audience to a battle that was no longer private. Robert leaned against his truck, staring at the horizon. He wasn't one for drama, but he knew this much. Linda Cartwright wasn't bluffing anymore. She was preparing for something bigger, and when it came, the entire neighborhood would be watching. But Robert had no idea that the moment she picked up the phone, the confrontation would reach a level neither of them could take back. The air was thick with tension that Saturday morning. Robert was up early, sweat on his brow before most of his neighbors had even poured their first cup of coffee. He had a delivery of equipment, nothing unusual for a man working acres of farmland. The growl of the engine, the clank of metal as he unloaded, echoed through the still neighborhood. To Robert, it was the sound of progress. To Linda Cartwright, it was an alarm bell. He had just set down a heavy toolbox near the barn when he heard her voice slice through the air. "Robert Jameson!" He turned, already knowing who it was. Linda stormed across the street, her steps quick, her face flushed under the Arizona sun. She wasn't carrying her usual clipboard this time. Her hands were free, balled into fists at her sides. Robert sighed quietly, brushing his hands on his jeans. "Good morning, Miss Cartwright." She didn't return the courtesy. "This ends today. You've been told again and again that this property is not acceptable for this neighborhood. Your equipment, your crops, your noise, it violates everything we stand for." Robert kept his voice steady. "With respect, it violates nothing. I've checked the zoning. I've spoken to the county. This land is mine, and it's legal for me to farm it." Neighbors had begun to gather, some stepping onto their porches, others pausing mid-yard work, pretending to trim hedges or wash cars while their eyes remained fixed on the confrontation. The show had started, and Linda knew she had an audience. She pointed sharply at the tractor parked behind him. "Do you really expect us to believe this belongs in a community of families? Kids playing, homes being sold, property values at stake? Look at this mess!" Robert crossed his arms, the sun beating down on the brim of his cap. "That tractor feeds people. That mess is hard work, not a threat." Her face tightened, and she stepped closer. "Don't you dare talk to me like that. I am the elected president of this HOA, and if you won't comply, I will take matters further." He could feel the weight of every watching eye, the silence of neighbors hanging on every word. He knew exactly where this was going. Robert's voice dropped lower, calm but firm. "I told you before, Linda. The HOA has no say over me. You keep threatening, but the law isn't on your side." Her lips curled into something between a sneer and a smile. "Oh, I'll make the law see my side. Watch me." She pulled a phone from her pocket, her thumb already swiping across the screen. Robert shook his head, turning back toward his truck. "Don't do this," he said quietly, almost to himself. But she had already raised the phone to her ear. "Yes, 911. Her voice carried across the street, theatrical, designed for everyone within earshot. "There's a suspicious man on my property. He's trespassing. He's refusing to leave. He looks dangerous." Gasps rippled among the neighbors. Some looked uneasy, shifting their weight, while others stared at Robert as if suddenly seeing him through a different lens. Robert froze for a moment, the words digging under his skin, not because they were true, but because he knew exactly how dangerous a false call like that could be. He turned back, locking eyes with her. "This is a mistake." Linda turned slightly, speaking louder into the phone. "Yes, I need officers immediately. He's threatening me right now." Robert's hands curled into fists, but he forced them to unclench. Losing his temper would only give her more ammunition. Instead, he lifted his voice so the entire street could hear. "I am not threatening you. I'm on my own property, and you know it." The neighbors exchanged uneasy glances. A man across the street whispered something to his wife, and she bit her lip nervously. Linda snapped the phone shut after giving the dispatcher her address. She looked triumphant, as if she had already won. "We'll let the deputies sort this out. Then maybe you'll finally understand where you stand in this community." Robert stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. He could hear the faint wail of sirens in the distance, growing louder. The neighborhood seemed to hold its breath, and then, in the midst of that silence, Robert spoke, his voice calm, steady, and clear. "You're about to regret making that call." But Linda didn't flinch. At least not yet. She had no idea the deputies rushing toward the neighborhood weren't about to drag Robert away. Instead, they were about to witness something that would leave her standing speechless in front of every single neighbor. The sirens grew louder, echoing off the stucco walls of the homes, bouncing down the cul-de-sac like a warning bell. The neighbors who had been pretending not to watch abandoned all pretense now. Lawn hoses were dropped, garage doors stayed open, kids pulled from bikes and ushered inside. Everyone wanted to see what would happen when the deputies pulled up. Robert stood tall in his driveway, dust clinging to his boots, sweat dripping down his temples. He wasn't nervous. He had dealt with plenty of tense calls before in his years of service. But this one was different. He wasn't showing up as the officer. He was the target. Linda paced at the edge of her yard, phone still in her hand, her face set in a mask of exaggerated fear. When a neighbor named Greg shuffled closer, she turned to him dramatically. "Do you see this? This man refuses to leave. He's aggressive. He's dangerous. I had no choice but to call." Greg rubbed the back of his neck, his eyes flicking between Robert and Linda. Linda, that's his land." "Not according to the HOA," she snapped, her voice loud enough for the small crowd to hear. "If he won't respect the rules, then he doesn't belong here. Period." Robert bit his tongue. He had learned long ago that silence often spoke louder than arguments, but inside he felt the slow burn of anger, not just because she lied, but because she twisted the truth in a way that was meant to humiliate him in front of everyone. The first squad car rolled into view, lights flashing red and blue against the bright desert sun. 2 deputies stepped out, their hands resting casually near their holsters as they surveyed the scene. Robert recognized them instantly, Deputy Carla Monroe and Deputy Luis Ortega. He'd worked alongside both of them before. Linda hurried toward them, practically waving her arms. "Officers, thank God you're here. That man," she jabbed a finger toward Robert, "is trespassing and threatening me. He won't leave my property. He's been harassing the neighborhood." Robert stood still, arms crossed, letting her words hang in the air. He could see Carla's brow furrow slightly, Ortega's eyes narrowing as they looked between him and Linda. Carla spoke first. "Ma'am, can you point to exactly where this happened?" Linda gestured wildly at Robert's barn and truck. "There, right there. He dragged all that equipment onto my land. I told him to leave, but he refused. He's dangerous." Ortega raised an eyebrow. "That's his property, ma'am, not yours." The crowd shifted, murmuring. Linda's cheeks reddened, but she pressed forward. "No, you don't understand. The HOA—" Carla cut her off gently but firmly. "The HOA doesn't override county zoning. We're familiar with this land. It's his." Robert finally stepped forward, his voice calm and steady. "Deputies, I've said nothing threatening. I've done nothing illegal. She called you under false pretenses." Linda spun toward him, her voice rising. "Don't you try to intimidate me. I know the law." That's when Robert reached into his back pocket. Slowly, deliberately, he pulled out a leather badge holder and flipped it open. The silver star glinted in the sunlight, unmistakable. The crowd gasped. Carla and Ortega didn't flinch. They already knew. But the neighbors? Their jaws dropped. Even Greg, who had been lingering near Linda, stepped back, muttering, "Wait a minute." Robert held the badge up, his eyes fixed on Linda. "I don't just know the law. I enforce it. You just called 911 on a deputy sheriff standing on his own land." Silence hit the street like a thunderclap. Every eye turned to Linda, waiting for her reaction. Her mouth opened, then closed again, her face draining of color. She stumbled for words, but nothing came out. Carla broke the silence. "Ma'am, filing a false police report is a serious offense. You claimed he was threatening you." "Did he?" Linda stammered. I felt threatened. He was standing there with all that equipment glaring at me." Ortega shook his head, unimpressed. "That's not a threat. That's a man working on his property." The crowd wasn't whispering anymore. They were openly talking now, voices carrying across the street. "Called the cops on her own neighbor. And he's a deputy? She's lost it this time." Robert lowered the badge, tucking it away again. His voice was even, but each word landed with weight. "This is what happens when assumptions replace facts. You didn't call because of equipment. You called because you didn't like me being here. But I'm not going anywhere." Linda looked around, desperate for someone to back her up. But the neighbors who had once nodded along at her complaints now avoided her gaze. But this was only the beginning, because while the badge silenced her in the moment, the fallout of that call would ripple through the entire neighborhood in ways no one saw coming. The squad car lights had faded, but the tension on the block hadn't gone anywhere. The deputies hadn't cuffed anyone, hadn't dragged Robert away, hadn't validated Linda's call the way she had imagined. Instead, they stood between 2 very different neighbors, one who had worked quietly, legally, and with dignity, and another who had spun a story that had collapsed the moment reality stepped in. Deputy Carla Monroe turned to Robert. "We'll file a note about the call, but you're good here. No violations, nothing illegal." Her tone was businesslike, but Robert caught the flicker of respect in her eyes. They had worked shifts together downtown. She knew exactly what kind of officer he was. "Appreciate you both coming out," Robert said. His voice carried no anger, just steadiness, though everyone watching could feel the weight behind his words. Linda stood stiffly a few feet away, arms crossed, trying to mask her humiliation with indignation. "So you're just going to ignore what I said? He's disrupting the community. He's lowering property values. He's making it impossible for people to feel safe in their own homes." Deputy Luis Ortega looked at her evenly. "Ma'am, safety means facts, not feelings. Nothing here suggests criminal behavior. This man is on his own property, doing his own work. That's the end of it." The neighbors, once whispering, now spoke openly. A woman on her porch muttered, "Told her he wasn't breaking any rules." Another man leaned against his mailbox and said louder than he needed to, "She's finally been called out." Linda's eyes darted from face to face. She was used to being the one people agreed with, the voice of authority in neighborhood disputes. But now, it was clear. She had overplayed her hand. Robert turned toward the deputies. "Thanks for handling this. I'll get back to my work." Carla gave him a nod, and Ortega followed her back to the cruiser. The sirens were cut, and soon the car rolled away, leaving behind a silence thicker than the heat radiating from the pavement. That silence broke with Linda's sharp voice. "This isn't over, Jameson." Robert paused, gripping the side of his truck. He turned slowly, his gaze steady on her. "It ended the moment you lied to the police. You should think about that before you make another call." Her face flushed crimson, but she didn't respond. She spun on her heel and stormed back across the street, retreating to the safety of her porch. The crowd didn't disperse right away. Instead, they lingered, whispering in clusters, shooting glances at Robert and then at Linda's house. For the first time, the neighborhood didn't seem united behind her. The seeds of doubt had been planted, and everyone could see who had been in the wrong. Sharon, the woman who had once timidly spoken at the HOA meeting, approached Robert slowly. I didn't know you were law enforcement." Robert gave a small shrug. "I don't usually lead with it. Doesn't change who I am or what I do here." Sharon nodded, eyes downcast. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have let her sway me like that. I see you working hard every day. That means something." Robert gave her a half smile. "It means a lot that you said that. Thank you." As she walked back to her yard, Robert turned his attention to the barn. He still had work to do. Farming didn't stop for neighborhood drama, but the confrontation had shifted something in the air. He could feel it. From across the street, Linda's blinds quivered, the faint movement betraying that she was watching him again. But this time, her gaze didn't carry the same power. The badge had stripped her of the authority she tried to wield, and the neighborhood had seen it with their own eyes. Robert wiped his hands on his jeans and muttered under his breath, "One battle down." He knew Linda wasn't finished, not by a long shot, but her arsenal was smaller now, her credibility wounded. The desert sun blazed overhead, but Robert stood a little taller, not because of the badge in his pocket, but because the truth had spoken louder than her lies. But while Robert thought the storm had passed, he didn't yet realize that the fallout of this moment would stir deeper questions in the neighborhood, questions about prejudice, power, and who truly belonged. The dust hadn't even settled from the deputy's departure before the story began to spread. By sundown, everyone on the block knew what had happened, that Linda Cartwright had called 911 on a man who wasn't just her neighbor, but also a county deputy. And worse, she had been caught exaggerating every word of her complaint. Robert tried to carry on with his evening routine, feeding the chickens, checking the irrigation lines, sweeping out the barn. But no matter what he did, he could feel the stares from across the street. Linda's blinds twitched as though she were pulling them back every few minutes. Other neighbors lingered outside longer than usual, whispering in low voices when they thought he wasn't looking. Later, as Robert carried a bucket of water toward the barn, Greg, the neighbor who had been caught in the middle during the confrontation, walked over. He scratched his chin nervously before speaking. "Listen, Rob, I didn't know you were with the sheriff's office," Greg said. Robert set the bucket down and gave him a steady look. "That supposed to change anything?" Greg shook his head quickly. No. I mean, look, people around here, they listen to Linda. She's been running things for years. But today, man, she looked, I don't know, foolish." Robert let out a short breath. Not quite a laugh. "Truth has a way of doing that," Greg nodded. "Some folks needed to see it. They needed to see she doesn't always know what she's talking about." He hesitated, then added quietly, "But don't think she's going to back down. She doesn't lose well." Robert already knew that. He could see it written in her stiff posture when she had stormed back inside her house. He had dealt with difficult people before, both on the job and in life. The pattern was always the same. When they lost control, they either lashed out harder or retreated and plotted the next move. The following day, the whispers turned into open chatter. Sharon, the woman who had once sided with Linda at the HOA meeting, stopped Robert by the road. "I just want you to know," she said, her voice hesitant but sincere. "A lot of us don't agree with how she treated you. You've been respectful. You've worked hard. That means something." Robert tipped his cap. "Appreciate that." Sharon shifted uncomfortably. "She's already spinning it, though, telling people you pulled your badge to scare her, saying you used your position to intimidate." Robert's jaw tightened, but his voice stayed calm. "I pulled my badge so she'd understand she couldn't twist the truth. That's it." Sharon gave him a small, almost apologetic smile. "I believe you, but not everyone will. Just be ready." That night, as the desert cooled and the cicadas hummed in the distance, Robert sat on his porch with a cup of black coffee. The events of the past 2 days weighed heavy on him. He thought about his father again, how the man had taught him that respect wasn't something you demanded. It was something you earned over time. Robert had lived by that code, both as a farmer and as a deputy. But this wasn't just about respect anymore. It was about truth. It was about neighbors who were willing to believe a lie because it came from someone they trusted. And it was about the danger of those lies when they were backed by authority, even if it was just an HOA president with a clipboard and a loud voice. He stared at the barn, the land stretching beyond it. He wasn't going to give it up. He wasn't going to be driven out. He had worked too long and too hard. The next morning, as Robert walked to his truck, he spotted Linda at the end of her driveway. Her arms were folded, her posture stiff. She didn't say a word, but the glare in her eyes spoke volumes. Robert simply nodded once, climbed into his truck, and drove toward town. He had nothing to prove to her, but he knew this wasn't the end. Linda Cartwright didn't like losing face, and after what had happened, she was more determined than ever to claw it back. But the neighborhood had already shifted. The illusion of her authority cracked wide open, and now people were beginning to question not just her power, but the reasons behind her hostility. By the time a week had passed, the neighborhood didn't feel the same. Conversations that used to circle around lawn care and school events now circled around one thing: Linda Cartwright's 911 call. At the coffee shop down the road, Robert overheard 2 men at the counter. "Did you hear about that farmer they tried to run off?" one asked. "Yeah," the other replied, shaking his head. "Turns out he's a deputy. Can you believe she did that?" Word traveled fast in Mesa, and the more it spread, the harder it became for Linda to keep her grip on the neighborhood. People who once marched behind her at HOA meetings now kept their distance. Those who had stayed silent started to find their voices. Robert didn't revel in it. That wasn't his style. He went on with his work, his boots in the soil from dawn until dusk, his focus on the land he had fought so hard to own. But he couldn't ignore the shift. For the first time since he moved in, people waved as they passed his property. Some even stopped to chat, offering small words of support. One evening, as Robert unloaded a feed bag from his truck, Sharon approached with her teenage son in tow. She hesitated before speaking. "I wanted to thank you," she said softly. Robert raised an eyebrow. "For what?" "For keeping calm that day. My son was watching from our porch. He saw how she yelled, how you stood your ground without yelling back. He asked me later why she treated you like that. I didn't know what to say. Robert looked at the boy, then back at Sharon. Sometimes people make assumptions before they know the truth. It's important to show them that truth, not with anger, but with patience. The boy nodded, absorbing the lesson. Sharon gave Robert a grateful smile before leading her son back home. But not everyone was ready to let go of Linda's influence. A handful of neighbors still clung to her version of the story. They whispered that Robert had abused his position, that flashing his badge was a threat, that Linda was the real victim. One evening at the gas station, Robert ran into Greg again. The man leaned against his car, lowering his voice. "She's telling anyone who'll listen that you embarrassed her on purpose, says you wanted to humiliate her." Robert sighed. "She humiliated herself. I just told the truth." Greg nodded, but his eyes darted nervously. "Careful, Rob. She's not done fighting. You don't know how far she'll go." Robert gave a faint smile. "I've dealt with worse than HOA politics." Still, that night on his porch, Robert thought about those words. He wasn't afraid of Linda, but he understood something deeper. This wasn't just about an HOA anymore. It was about pride, prejudice, and the dangerous mix of both. The following Saturday, the HOA held another meeting. Robert decided to attend, not to stir trouble, but to sit quietly in the back. The moment he walked in, the room shifted. Some greeted him with nods and small smiles. Others avoided eye contact. And at the front of the room, Linda sat stiffly, her papers stacked in neat piles, her lips pressed into a thin line. She cleared her throat, beginning her usual agenda, but when the floor opened for discussion, things didn't go as she planned. A man stood. "I think we've gone too far with this nonsense about Robert's farm. The man owns his land. It's legal. We're wasting our time and making ourselves look bad." Murmurs of agreement followed. Linda slammed her papers down. "This isn't nonsense. This is about protecting our homes and our community." But the room no longer rallied behind her. Another woman spoke up. "Protecting the community doesn't mean harassing a neighbor who's done nothing wrong." Linda's face flushed, her voice trembling with anger. "You don't understand what's at stake." Robert rose quietly from the back. His voice was calm, steady, but it carried through the room. "What's at stake is trust. Neighbors should look out for each other, not tear each other down. I didn't move here to fight with anyone. I moved here to work my land and contribute something honest." The room fell into silence. People shifted, uncomfortable but thoughtful. Linda glared at him, but she didn't interrupt. Robert continued, "We can disagree on a lot of things, but calling the police on someone for doing nothing wrong? That's not protecting the community. That's damaging it." A smattering of applause broke out, tentative at first, then stronger. Linda's shoulders stiffened, her eyes darting across the room as if searching for backup. But it didn't come. Robert sat down again, his point made. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't insulted her. He had simply spoken truth, and the truth had landed harder than any outburst ever could. But the meeting was only the beginning. The real test would come afterward, in the quiet moments, when neighbors had to decide which version of the story they believed, and whose side they truly stood on. That night, after the HOA meeting, Robert sat alone on his porch, the desert air finally cooling as the last streaks of daylight disappeared over the horizon. His hat rested on the table beside him, and the only sound was the distant bark of a dog and the occasional hum of a passing car. For the first time since he bought the land, he felt something shifting, not in the soil beneath his boots, but in the way the neighborhood saw him. He thought back to the day he signed the papers for the property. The real estate agent had shaken his hand, congratulating him on finding such a prime stretch of land at the edge of the city. "Perfect for building something lasting," the agent had said. Robert believed it. He had dreamed of this for years, of creating something his nieces and nephews could visit, of leaving behind more than just a paycheck from the sheriff's department. He wanted to build legacy, not just property. But now, sitting in the quiet, he realized the farm had become more than just crops and barns. It had become a stage. Every move he made was watched, judged, and interpreted, and Linda Cartwright had tried her best to twist that narrative into something ugly. Robert leaned back in his chair, letting the memories of the past few weeks run through his mind. The accusations, The lies, the flashing lights, the look on her face when he showed his badge. He wasn't a man to gloat, but he couldn't deny the satisfaction of knowing truth had exposed her for what she was. Still, that satisfaction came with a sobering weight, because it shouldn't take a badge for people to see his worth. He thought about Sharon's son, the boy who had asked why a neighbor would treat him so harshly. That question lingered with him. Kids don't see property values or HOA bylaws. They see actions. They see fairness or unfairness. And what that boy saw was a woman shouting lies and a man holding his ground with patience. Robert picked up his phone, scrolling through his contacts until he landed on Marcus Lowe, his friend from the sheriff's office. He tapped call, and after a few rings, Marcus's voice came through. "You holding up?" Marcus asked. Robert exhaled. "Yeah. It's been a week," Marcus chuckled. "I heard. Word's all over the department. You handled it better than most would have." "I didn't want to pull the badge," Robert admitted. "But she left me no choice, and now, instead of people seeing me as a farmer, they see me as a deputy who had to prove himself to his own neighbors." Marcus's tone grew serious. "Sometimes people don't see the truth unless it's shoved in their face. But you know this, Rob. Your patience, your calm. That's what people will remember. Not the badge." Robert let the words settle. Maybe Marcus was right. Maybe his calm had done more than the silver star could. After hanging up, Robert stood and walked to the edge of his property. The moonlight spilled across the rows of soil, casting long shadows between the ridges. This was his land, every acre paid for with sweat and sacrifice. No HOA president, no rumor, no false call could take that away. But the incident had opened his eyes. It wasn't just about defending his farm. It was about standing against the small, everyday ways people try to exclude others. It was about reminding his neighbors and himself that dignity isn't granted by someone else's approval. It's lived every single day. As he stood there, the faint creak of a screen door caught his attention. He looked up to see Sharon on her porch, waving slightly before stepping back inside. Across the street, Linda's blinds shifted again, the faintest sliver of her face visible before snapping shut. Robert smiled faintly. The neighborhood had changed. Some neighbors saw him differently now, with more respect. Others still clung to their suspicions. And Linda? She would never admit defeat. But none of that defined him. He turned back toward his house, his voice low but firm, as if speaking to himself. "You don't need anyone's permission to belong." But the story wasn't finished yet, because the real lesson wasn't just about Robert and Linda, but about every neighbor who had watched, listened, and now had to decide what kind of community they wanted to be. The days that followed weren't quiet, but they were different. For the first time, the story didn't revolve around what Linda Cartwright wanted. The neighbors had seen too much with their own eyes. They'd heard her words, they'd watched Robert's calm response, and they'd witnessed the deputies walk away without a single hand laid on him. No spin could erase that. Robert knew better than to expect peace overnight. Linda still lived across the street, and her blinds still twitched at the slightest movement. But now, the weight of her authority was gone. The clipboard, the titles, the threats, none of it carried the same sting. People had stopped nodding along out of habit. They were questioning, doubting, and some even apologizing for going along with her so easily. One afternoon, Robert was repairing a section of fence when Sharon walked up again. This time, she brought cookies wrapped in foil. She set them on the fence post and cleared her throat. "My husband and I talked," she said, her eyes downcast. "We should have spoken up sooner. You didn't deserve the way she treated you." Robert wiped his hands on his jeans and offered a small smile. "Takes courage to admit that, thank you." Her shoulders eased, and for the first time, she looked relieved. "My son. He keeps asking questions about fairness, about right and wrong. I told him what I should have known from the start. People don't get to decide who belongs just because they don't like what they see." Robert nodded. "That's a lesson worth learning, young." Word by word, action by action, the story shifted. The same neighbors who once kept their distance now waved when they passed his driveway. Some even stopped to ask about the crops or admire the barn that had once been the center of controversy. But Robert didn't let it go to his head. He understood how fragile perception could be. Today he was seen as steady, respectful, and patient. Tomorrow, one rumor could shift it all. That's why he kept working, why he kept showing up with quiet dignity. Not to prove Linda wrong, not to win popularity, but to remind himself that the only approval that mattered was his own. Linda, however, wasn't done. She filed complaints with the county, sent out HOA newsletters with veiled barbs, and tried to corner neighbors into supporting her side. But each attempt fell flatter than the last. People had seen the truth too clearly now, and once the curtain had been pulled back, it was hard to believe her theater again. One evening, Greg walked over while Robert was closing up the barn. He leaned against the fence, hands shoved into his pockets. "Funny thing," Greg said. "For years we all thought Linda was keeping this place together. Turns out, maybe she was just keeping us scared." Robert chuckled softly. "Fear only works until someone calls it out." Greg nodded. "You called it out without even raising your voice. Respect." Robert glanced back at his land, the barn glowing in the last light of the setting sun. "Respect isn't about how loud you are, it's about how consistent you are." That night, Robert reflected again on everything that had happened. He realized something important, that the real power of the incident wasn't just in clearing his name. It was in showing people how dangerous assumptions could be. A single phone call had nearly painted him as a criminal on his own property. And if he hadn't had that badge, things might have gone very differently. The lesson was bigger than him. It was about slowing down, about questioning the stories we're told, about asking ourselves whether we're siding with truth or with comfort. It was about resisting the easy path of judgment, because judgment, when misplaced, can ruin lives. Robert leaned back in his porch chair, his voice low as if speaking to the desert night itself. Don't let fear dictate who belongs. And maybe that was the real takeaway, not just for his neighbors, but for anyone listening. We all live in communities. We all share fences, sidewalks, streets. And at some point, we all face the choice. Do we let suspicion rule us, or do we build respect instead? For Robert, the answer was simple. Keep working, keep showing up, keep standing tall in the truth, because dignity doesn't come from permission. It comes from living each day with honesty. So if you're listening to this story, remember, the way you treat people says more about you than it ever says about them. Choose respect, choose truth, and never let assumptions write someone else's story. And if you found meaning in Robert's story, make sure to subscribe, because stories like this remind us of the lessons worth carrying into our own lives.